Habari Senu, Bipi, Nimimi Bueno, Luis, Nakaribuni, the Global Playlist. Last week, we met a wonderful guest, Jacob, and now it's time to learn more about Kenyan music through his tips and his experience. Kenya is named after Mount Kenya, the highest peak in Africa after Kilimanjaro. It's a land of infinite landscapes, astonishing sunsets and jungles, and of course, of beautiful animals. And great athletes too. But probably you already know that, right? But did you know that Nyatiti, a millenary music instrument, still has a strong influence in Kenyan pop music? Neither did I, and that's why we are here. A large part of the African countries still preserve important elements of their ancestral cultures, and that is something that you can definitely feel in Kenyan music. In a flourishing music industry where Benga, the Kenyan pop, or Kapuka and Genge, key subgenres to understand Kenyan hip-hop, are still good examples. Actually, Western music has never had a huge impact, but as you might have guessed, the Western genres that have had more influence in modern Kenyan music are soul, R&B, and rap. Sorry, rock and pop. Let's talk about Kenyan music. What are the main traditional genres in Kenya?
I mean, for any country, but I think for a country like Kenya, and probably translates to a lot of African countries, it's a tough question because we have so many tribes here. And because of that, we have so many languages, so many cultures, so many different kinds of music that kind of spawn from those things, from those cultures, those tribes. One of the most iconic things about Kenyan music, and one like the standouts about Kenyan music, is the guitar, almost ahead of the voice in the lead singer. And I think that all really kind of spawned from the tradition of Benga music. Benga kind of originated from the western part of Kenya, a place called Nyanza province. And that's where the tribe called the Luo live. They're either the second or third biggest tribe in the country, I forget which one. And it really came from an instrument that I think is also really attributed to the Luo, although there are different kinds of versions of this instrument, called the Nyatiti. But I think that the most typical one, it's like a lyre, like a lyre kind of string instrument. So it's usually like a lot of kind of ostinato kind of vibe. And then it's really about the singing over the top of that ostinato that kind of carries the message, the emotion. For like the kind of extended playlist, I chose a song called Kotbiro by an artist called Ayub Ogada, who I think probably would be regarded as one of like the most influential Nyatiti players. And he passed away just a couple of years ago, I think in 2019. But this song in particular, it became kind of like a quintessential song to kind of depict Africa and like Kenya in a sense. It was in a bunch of movies. I think the most famous one would have been a movie called The Constant Gardener. And the reason I bring all this up is because from that Nyatiti, I think in the late 40s, after World War II, not a lot, but there were soldiers that came back after the war. And one of the things they brought back from that war was the Spanish guitar. And then within that Luo community, they kind of, instead of taking the traditional kind of just kind of strumming the guitar, they kind of incorporated the way that the Nyatitis plucked and played to develop this style called Benga. And so Benga is really characterized now by having like a really fast-paced rhythm and guitars which are like the forefront of it. There can be up to like 4 guitarists, like lead guitarists, who are all generally like kind of playing like really energetic, kind of bouncy, usually high-pitched kind of guitar lines and harmonies. And so the music kind of builds up to like that moment. And if you ever go to like a live Benga show here in Kenya, that kind of like really promotes the kind of dancing that we have here, which is usually like massive group-based, like a simple kind of form of choreography. Like let's say I want like to the left, to the right kind of thing, and then everyone will do the same thing. And it's never really planned. It's never like so strict. The choreography will change, and so will the guitar line, and that will prompt like another choreographic move, and like everyone's kind of doing it. So it's like a really big thing.
Could you mention some prominent artists of Benga?
The biggest one, another guy who's passed away, is a guy called John Ogara Odondi. He's like the trailblazer. He's like, I think around the time of the 70s when Benga was becoming a real hit. So he would have been the guy. One of the guys who's like really trying to keep the Benga is a guy called Dan Chizi Asada. Well, I think he's called like the crowned prince of Benga. He's probably like the guy, at least like in the Nairobi Benga scene, like who's like trying to like really keep pushing it forward. And then there's a lot of other groups where maybe they're not as authentically kind of Bengan, if that was a word, but have like the music has been so inspired by Benga. And at the top of that list, you probably find a group called Les Wanyika. And I think their most popular song is a song called Sinamakosa. Then there's another band called Them Mushrooms. Them Mushrooms are a band in Kenya, and their claim to fame is a song called Jambo Bana. The reason why it's so famous is because of its impact on tourists. And so if you were to come to Kenya and you were to go, for example, on safari, and you go to a hotel, and you find a live band playing there, you will hear this song Jambo Bwana, because it's basically like a welcome to Kenya. And I think it's also kind of belovedly known, especially among tourists, as like the Hakuna Matata song, because everyone knows Hakuna Matata from The Lion King. The singer will like just say random things about like, you can just forget your worries. And after every sentence, everyone says Hakuna Matata, da 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 da, Hakuna Matata. And it can go on forever. If you're a tourist, I highly recommend it. It's a really fun time. And I'd say also the artist who's probably Kenya's most well-renowned musical export, whose name is Eric Wainaina. One of his most well-known songs is a song called Inchi ya Kitu Kidogo, which was a song that was highlighting the corruption that exists within Kenya. I highly doubt Eric Wainaina can like play a show and not play that song just because it's so beloved.
So guys, you will find all these songs and artists in the playlist of the episode. Nowadays is Nigeria, right? The main music exporter in the whole continent, and is exploding all over the world, right?
There's a running joke, I think, probably around Africa, that you'll find Nigerian anywhere you go. Anywhere you want to go in the world, there'll be a Nigerian there. I mean, you'll never know how they got there, what they're doing there, but they'll be there. And that's they also have what would be like the equivalent of Hollywood or Bollywood in India, and they call it predictably Nollywood, where they kind of produce a lot of like very dramatic kind of cinema, like over dramatic for my taste. When you hear like kind of Afrobeat kind of influencing also a lot of like American music these days from people like Drake and everyone in between, although he's Canadian, but that kind of Western music, it's all coming from or influenced by, or more often than not, the Nigerian market. Yeah.
Nowadays, what do you think is happening in Kenya regarding music?
I still think we're trying to discover our sound. I think, as I said, a lot of African music is quite similar, just as I said, like a benga. There's like kind of versions of what would be considered a benga kind of beat or groove in different parts of Africa. And I think we also have music that would kind of be considered very similar to, if not almost exactly the same as Afrobeat. We have, I think now maybe it's referred to as boomba beat, but when I was growing up, there was a style of music called kapuka, which is kind of referring to, let's say Kenyan hip hop. It was influences of like hip hop and reggae in particular, I'd say.
Reggae is also really popular in Kenya.
Oh yeah, when I was growing up, the group that was doing that kind of reggae thing that I remember, who have since disbanded, I believe, were a group called Unnecessary Noise. For me, the best song on that album was the reggae song called Bless My Room. It also did really well. And yeah, just to circle back to my original point, I think if we had a similar kind of mechanism as what the Nigerians had, I think it could have been, and possibly still could be, as influential as what Afrobeat has become in Nigeria.
How many tribes and different languages are there in Kenya?
When I've been growing up, it's always been said that there's 42 tribes that are kind of official and recognized. I think that number has probably grown to maybe 44, 46 now. Probably at least 50 different languages around Kenya that are spoken. But because of our colonial history, we were colonized by the British, so English and Swahili are considered like the two official languages. Mm-hmm. But like, for example, if you're in Nairobi and you're going out on any given day, you'll hear at least 5 languages. It's very common, like within Kenya, to have this kind of idea of code switching. You'll go to a party, for example, and part of the conversation will take place in English. Part of it will be kind of in Swahili. Maybe part of it will incorporate another kind of tribal language. We just go on our way.
If it flows, it must be fun.
Yeah.
And what is Gengeton?
Gengeton? Actually, I'm not sure I know much about Gengeton. But yeah, definitely I hear Gengeton like as a rhythm, as a groove talked about a lot in Kenya these days. And it's something that I hear a lot of people talk, because we have these vehicles in Kenya called matatus, the kind of the public transport vehicles. Depending on who's in the matatu, they'll kind of adjust their playlist. But assuming like it's more like the youth kind of people who you'd assume are like urban, speaking Shang kind of thing, then you would hear Gengeton. So I know I've even heard it, but I just don't know. Like I couldn't tell you like the artist names, the songs. I just know I've heard it.
I've been listening to it actually, and it's close to reggaeton and dancehall and even some gangsta rap. Like a bit darker than hip hop and so on. Yeah.
That kind of doom,
that's it.
That kind of beat happened a lot of like that kind of kapuka era as well.
Would you like to mention some other genres or artists?
Yeah. I can mention a couple more. Okay, so going back to Eric Wainaina, he also had like a really monumental song that he released in 1998. The American embassy was bombed here. I don't think this is when he released the song, but this song is kind of became an unofficial anthem called Daima. This is probably sacrilegious to say, but I actually think it's better than our national anthem. I think I also included, to kind of keep that influence of the Benga group, but also the idea of like different languages in Kenya. So Eric Wainaina is from a tribe called the Kikuyu. And so there's a couple songs that I wrote down called Rituari Aku and Nekekiaga. So those are great songs. But then also on the more kind of alternative underground route, I wanted to shout out a guy who was very influential to me, and he's still probably regarded as one of Kenya's, or maybe Nairobi's, and I'd say probably Kenya's top guitarists, called Kato Change. And he kind of does a kind of Afro jazz kind of thing. There was one song that I wanted to put on the playlist called Staccato, which is kind of, he's playing on the idea of like staccato rhythm, but also with his name in it, Staccato. But I couldn't find it on Spotify, so I'm not sure if it's there. So if it's not there, there's another song called Aparo, featuring another friend of mine called Lisa. I'd say like the jazz scene here, like it's more underground for the one thing, or maybe not underground, but let's say more niche. And I'd say it also kind of incorporates more like the American traditional kind of playing over changes, jazz kind of thing. I think it, again, kind of, it's more influenced by Latin American rhythms, like Cuban kind of things, maybe Brazilian kind of things, and you'll hear that in a song like Aparo. And then on the more alternative side, and like really more niche, I'd say, and probably still also underground, is this kind of singer-songwriter kind of feel, which again is probably more influenced by the Western world, but kind of finding its way in Kenya. And again, as we're trying to figure out our own identity, I don't think we've figured out this whole kind of singer-songwriter kind of thing as well. And I mentioned Sauti Sol earlier, and when I first encountered Sauti Sol, they started off as just kind of an acoustic kind of band, singing like really beautiful, like ballad kind of songs, and they had some success, but they had to really kind of transition to the more kind of upbeat, Benga influenced kind of pop feel to like really make their name. But there's one artist that I wanted to highlight called Njoki Karu. I think probably her most notable project, which again, kind of sadly has not really taken root in Kenya because of the subject matter, is that she composed, I'm not sure if it was all the music, but certainly most of like the soundtrack for a movie called Rafiki, which is a movie that got a lot of international acclaim because it was tackling an issue of lesbian relationships within Kenya, which Kenya is still miles behind like the Western world in terms of recognizing the LGBT community and relationships and anything that exists within it. We're still very religious, very conservative in that way. So actually even that movie, I don't think was allowed to be screened. I think maybe in the end, they allowed like 2 like maybe private screenings just so that it could be allowed to be nominated for an Oscar or something like that. Otherwise, I don't think any Kenyans had really seen the movie just because the subject matter was so controversial. And Njoki Karu wrote a lot of the soundtrack for this movie. And particularly there was a song called Stay, which I think might have been the title track of the movie. And she writes in at least English and Swahili that I've heard. And also, it was very hard to choose which ones. I love so much from music, but I also chose a song called Holds. There's a band called Just a Band, who I think now they're pretty much disbanded and then they're doing their own individual things. But they also kind of rose to prominence because of a song called Ha He, which kind of highlighted a Kenyan superhero called Makmende. Makmende is like the Sheng word for hero. And like it used to be a really big thing of like if you were doing something that was like impossible to do, or you're trying to do something that's impossible to do, people would ask you like, who do you think you are, Makmende kind of thing. They just have very interesting music that again incorporates different kind of cultural traditional elements of Kenyan music, but it's also again very kind of alternative and just new and interesting and fresh. And also there's another song I really like called Probably for Lovers. Yes, those are the 2 artists I want to add on the extended playlists. But otherwise, I think I'm ready to move on to the main event.
Thanks a lot, Jacob. But just something that came to my mind. What happened with rock has never really been popular in Kenya, right?
No, not so much. It's very niche, I'd say. You will find like little enclaves, and you can even find like really heavy like metal kind of music, but I don't think it has ever, and I would be very surprised if it will ever like really break into like the mainstream music scene here. It doesn't kind of keep with the Benga beat, let's say.
We will try to include some rock bands also, even if they are really underground.
Next week, finally, we will discover what song will represent Kenya in the global playlist. Remember that you can listen to all this Kenyan music in the playlist Music of Kenya in Spotify. You're gonna love it. See you next week.